welcome to yet another session of Financial Fridays. I'm Venkatesh Gopal from MoveMe. MoveMe is a small boutique agency focused on shared mobility, and we call ourselves shared mobility architects. Basically, what we do is we design, plan, and build shared mobility services such as car sharing, micromobility, scooter sharing, and also integrate those with public transit, work on such projects. We've done about 60 projects so far, and I'm very excited to talk about financials in micromobility today, a topic very dear to my heart. I'm so excited to have this panel with us today. Before we get into the questions, why don't I have all our panelists talk about what they do and what motivates them about shared mobility. Let me start with you, Molly.
Hi, thanks for having me today. My name is Molly Millar. I chair the Transportation Advisory Committee for the City of Vancouver, and I've also been involved and worked for a couple of micromobility companies, including kind of a dockless bike sharing company and more recently a shared scooter company. And when I say scooter, I mean kind of the sit-down Vespa type of scooter. So yeah, I've got some perspective on both sides of the coin here, but looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. And about you, Elliot?
Yeah, thank you for having me. My name is Elliot Mcfadden. I am the Greater Minnesota Shared Mobility Coordinator at the Minnesota Department of Transportation, but come from a long history in shared mobility. I, about 15 years ago, launched the first car sharing service in the state of Texas, and then was the CEO of Austin B-Cycle, the bike share program in Austin, Texas. While there, I was a co-founder of the North American Bike Share Association and served on its board. So got to see a lot of the changes from station-based systems to the introduction of dockless and scooters, both to the good and ill, and had an opportunity to pilot some dockless bike and scooter systems as well while I was the head of that system. And for me, what makes me excited about shared mobility is really bringing the whole package of an alternative to single occupancy vehicles and automotive ownership. So cars are sold as the one solution that can get you wherever you want to go. And when you look at transit and shared mobility, no one option is going to be the best for every trip. You need to choose a different mode depending on where you want to go and your time and all of that. And I think it can be a superior way of getting around and produce a great quality of life. But in order for that to happen, we need to really have options that meet everybody's needs. So I'm excited to see how it integrates with transit and other existing providers and all of the new innovation that's coming out.
Exciting, thank you. And lastly, Ben.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Venkatesh. So my name is Ben LaRocco. I lead government partnerships, which is working with cities across the United States and Canada for Superpedestrian, which is a manufacturing and engineering firm based out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and our shared scooter brand, Link. We're fairly new to the scooter space. We launched our first market about this time last year in January of 2020. And since then, we really sort of ramped up post-COVID. So since July of last year, we've launched in about 15 markets in the US and Europe, including Seattle, Columbus, Ohio, Salt Lake City, Rome, Italy, Madrid, Spain, and a number of others across the North America and Canada, North America and Europe. And looking forward to talking about this because I've sort of been living the economics of micromobility for the last couple of years. So happy to share my insights and how they relate to the current and future of mobility.
Awesome. I mean, within this group, I'm so happy that we got like each one of you has a balanced experience between policy, city, working with cities, and operational. Your current role might be tuned towards one or the other, but then I'm so happy that I was able to get you guys on board. Thank you for joining us, guys. So speaking about providing last mile connectivity. And facing a backlash from the cities due to the previous reputation, scooter sharing companies or business models have had seemingly tougher time in profitability among the shared mobility businesses as a whole. I mean, shared mobility as a whole is not like the one solution for everybody to be billionaires from the profit that it gives out. But still, three areas come to mind when you're talking about profitability in scooter sharing: vehicle life cycle, city policies, or how to navigate the city policies, and utilization or rebalancing. And I'm just going to start with each one of you to pick one of these areas as your favorite, and maybe how would you rank these three areas: the vehicles, city policies, and utilization, and why would you do so? Starting with you, Ben.
Sure. I would say that I think as it relates to city policy, as it relates to utilization, is probably the most important cost factor of those two. I do think that vehicle life is quite an important factor. And I say that is I have been in shared scooters pretty much since the beginning of shared scooters. I was with another scooter company before Superpedestrian. When I first joined the shared scooter industry, scooters took longer to get from China, where they were manufactured, to the US, and they were actually on the ground in utilization. So the average life of a scooter was about 4 weeks from the time it hit the ground until it was basically, depreciated to the point where it couldn't be ridden anymore. Utilization was very high at that time, but when you're, only talking about maybe 100 rides per scooter, it's impossible to make money. And also you have a ton of, environmental costs to that. The negative externalities of scooters for that. Today, I think all of the manufacturers, all of the providers that are out there are doing a much better job of that. And so instead of 100, you're probably talking somewhere in the, 700 range for the average scooter that's being put out today. Superpedestrian, we put a lot of upfront investment in our scooter. It was originally designed to be used for sharing. So, we only have a year of use so far, but from our data coming back, our average scooter is going to take about 2,500 trips on average is our expected lifespan. So the depreciation cost over those 2,500 trips is quite small. And so with the right upfront design and manufacturing costs, depreciation itself will be quite low. And it's quite a bit lower now, again, across the board for everybody than it was 3 years ago. Utilization and city policies, like high utilization can forgive a lot of sins. So, if you're having, generally they say 2 to 3 TVD is about where scooter share is going to be pretty break even. Our break even number is a little bit lower than that. But if you have high utilization, you can pay for a lot more rebalancing. You can pay for a lot more labor to clean things up. You can pay for higher permit fees. I think some of the highest permit fees in America are Santa Monica, California, and Miami, Florida. Both of places which, are very dense, have high ridership, and they can afford it. Cleveland, Ohio, not as high, right? Detroit, Michigan, I don't think they have any permit fees at all. And I think permit fees actually right now make a lot of sense for cities to invest in this new mode of transportation. So for the most part, the companies are happy to share those investments. The industry is quite competitive right now. So I don't know if that will be the case forever, but right now it's quite competitive. And so companies are sort of happy to make those investments. But it's always helpful when those investments go back to, infrastructure so that so that their customers can use the vehicles, program management so that there's, responsible folks that are monitoring it. And then also the third-party data management is one that they often use too. So I'm off on a little bit of a tangent there, so I'll wrap up. In general, and maybe we can come back to this more after other folks talk, permit fees and a lot of city policies are not a super big driver of profitability or loss if ridership is high. If ridership is not high, then those things all get to be a lot more important. And again, so I'll pause there, but I'll come back and happy to go in a little bit more in depth if we have time or if there's interest.
Yes, we'll definitely delve more deeper into that. Directing towards you, Molly, what's your ranking in policy, vehicle, and utilization?
Well, I really agree with Ben, just that city policy and utilization go hand in hand. And from my personal experience, it is really hard to be successful in a city without a partnership approach with said city. It's the fees, sometimes the vehicle, the asset restrictions, all of those things. It's allowing private companies to roll out an equitable service. I mean, that just doesn't happen if you don't have fantastic partnerships with cities and an understanding that this is a shared space for all of us. This kind of form of transportation, it is a public service, and if you're just leaving it up to the private companies to run of their own volition, you don't see the best service for everyone, a best rollout of service for everyone. So I think the city policy and the utilization is so important. One of the biggest issues from where I'm from, which is Vancouver, Victoria, is theft. And again, that's a conversation that shared micromobility companies need to be having with cities and in partnership with cities. Just to give you an example, I ran a dockless bike sharing company in Victoria, which is our capital city of BC, and our asset limit was at about 100 vehicles at any given time, and over 9 months we had to put 700 vehicles on the streets because of theft. And so you cannot run a business. You absolutely cannot. And we were very disappointed in the city's response, and it was kind of put right on us as as our responsibility. And so, yeah, it's definitely it's a combo thing there.
I understand. And when I'm thinking Victoria, I'm like, oh, 600 extra bikes of the same brand in maybe 8 months, what you mentioned. And I was like, where did those bikes go? You probably can be able to spot those on the streets, right?
Well, they're torn apart really quickly.
Exactly.
And reutilized. Lots of like different bikes. We saw our bikes in different parts, also shipped away, but it was like astounding. And you see the same thing in Vancouver. We've got a wonderful a wonderful docked bike sharing system, and I don't know why I wasn't at the table when the ultimate decision was to go with docked, but thank goodness we did. Otherwise, they'd be struggling. They'd be in a world of pain right now. So it's like the the helmets. They've gone through like 2 or 3 full cycles of every helmet being stolen, but the bikes are okay because they're docked. So.
Which I'm sure many micromobility operators would agree. And lastly, Elliot, your top 3 rankings.
Yeah, it's funny. When I joined Austin B-Cycle as its CEO, my board chair told me the first thing I learned in bike share school is there's no money in bike share. And I think the thing that gets lost on a lot of this is the transportation sector, no matter where you are in the transportation sector, is a very hard business to make money at. It is a resource intensive, real world, usually fairly low margin business. And I think there's been a fundamental mismatch between the approach that venture capital takes, which is you spend money to prove a concept and then you can scale up and take advantage of enormous efficiencies, which is just not ever going to be possible with transportation services. So I think there are problems with the vehicle life. There are problems with operational overhead. You know, I'm reminded that the Bixi system in Montreal, which was the first docked bike share system, when I visited them a few years ago, 8 years into their system, bike number 1 that rolled off the assembly line was still in service, circulating. So there are ways you can build the equipment that might be a little more expensive up front, There are business models like docked versus dockless that make a difference. But my focus, I would say, is definitely on the city and policy side. These are markets that are still developing, and for cities to look at these as an established industry that they can tax, I think is very short-sighted, because the amount of revenue that they're getting off of the permitting fees is relatively small versus the potential benefit. So, I think what's happening now is, because of the limitations and because it's so difficult to make money in this space, you're going to see on the private sector driven side mostly systems focusing on those very profitable markets. And we've seen in Minnesota some of the suburban systems that are suburban communities or outside of the Twin Cities that in the first year or two of scooters had multiple providers knocking on their door. Now they put out RFPs and nobody responds. So I actually think in the long term, outside of the really dense profitable areas, we're going to need to start looking at public-private partnerships, which totally flips this conversation away from how much can I make off of this to how much am I going to invest as a partner, which means I'm actually going to get the results I want from a policy perspective of where scooters are going to be, where bikes are going to be, but also that I'm going to help support this as an alternative way of getting around the community.
I totally agree that's the, I often think about like the short-term, long-term potential of scooters. And I think about, so I live in Washington, D.C. And in downtown D.C., it has one of the most successful bike and scooter share networks each in D.C. Right now, D.C., though, is in the process of really extending its metro system out to some pretty far-flung areas that are, pretty exurban from DC. And I was just thinking about how it would make sense to put like 100 scooters at each one of those far-flung metro stations. It would never make sense from a commercial standpoint. But from that city standpoint, there's a ton of opportunity there to build some infrastructure and a strategy around that. But we just, I think it's going to take a while for us to get from where we are today to that point, both from a business model standpoint and a political capital, sustainability standpoint.
But interesting that you mentioned that. So Ben, and Elliot, when we are talking about one, that the profitability isn't going to be the sole driver of such businesses for both sides. City and operators both can't be looking at making money in the shorter term, but then in the longer term for scooter sharing companies to consider that this is going to be a long term. They also need that kind of a commitment from the city that they will be available, and that will be like a similar to a transit service. One of the things that comes to mind is it's like politics. So when you have a longer term for the ruling party, they are more focused on delivering what they have to do instead of working on the next elections and trying to make this a play towards the elections. So that way, is the transit hub concept and all that is picking up as post-pandemic or the new micromobility play for cities, and is that going to be a big promise for us, Elliot?
Yeah, I think there's a huge potential there. Again, I think, I think cities need to, and other public partners need to be thinking of this differently. I see the way this is developed, which is very much a reflection of how TNC's developed, where there was a very adversarial, aggressive interaction by both sides. That played out in the early days of scooters and dockless bikes is unfortunate because, again, I think the profitability issue is going to be something that's going to need to get worked out over the long term. And frankly, it may never be, getting back to bike share, there's no money in bike share. It may never be truly profitable outside of very small markets. I ran one of the only bike share systems in the United States that was station-based, that was covering 100% of our operational costs because of all the festivals and things we had going on in Austin, Texas. But I had to get public funding for my equipment. We couldn't have funded that whole thing by itself. So I think you need that longer term commitment to really make these things work. And as we're coming out of the pandemic, we're going to need to figure out how to get people out of cars where they feel safe right now and get over the illusion that shared mobility and transit isn't safe, which it's shown all over the world has not been a producer of COVID and not a problem with the spread of the disease, but people feel like it is. So we're really going to need to be working hand in hand. And so I really, again, I would love to see a lot more of looking at this as a true partnership, which means that's going to mean more from the cities as well. They're going to need to come to the table, not just as a, documenting the fees and collecting the money, but how are we working with you to actually make this successful in our community? Because we need to have this. This is a missing link in a lot of places with transit and other kinds of shared mobility. So I think that's the approach we need to take is really being closer.
Working with cities, it also ensures that the services can serve, like, be in parts of the community where they don't have access to micromobility. Like, we know where micromobility kind of congregates and launches, but there's definitely underserved portions of every city that could benefit. And that's, again, a benefit of working with like a public-private partnership approach.
There's two sort of data specifications, GBFS,
yeah.
Which is the bike share feed, and that's sort of real time. So when you are looking for scooters or bikes in your app, real time, that's GBFS. That was actually a NABSA one. So Elliot, you might have been involved in that. NABSA owns that and manages that. The other one is MDS, which is the mobility data specification. And that came out of LADOT. And I would say if any city regulators or state regulators are watching this, it's really pretty standard practice now for operators to share GBFS and MDS. So it makes a lot of sense. I know in virtually all of our markets, we share those, and most operators do too. And MDS is a complement to GBFS because it's a store of the trip information. So you get so you know, where did the trip go? Where was the route? What time did the trip start? What time did it end? And so you can really use those two complementary data feeds to plan. So I think I actually had a great conversation with Kelowna a couple days ago where they've made a ton of awesome investments in their infrastructure, and now they're looking for the tools to help their citizens utilize those investments. And I think the Northern European cities, the reason that those are so micromobility, bike friendly is it's a public policy choice, not like an environmental choice or anything else. They really made the decision to invest in that infrastructure. And, sort of going back to what Elliot was saying, it's really a long-term, there's been all this focus on scooters for 3 years, but scooters really need 10 years because the cities need to update the infrastructure. People need to figure out how to update their movement patterns and all that sort of thing. So as cities can use that data to invest in new infrastructure, I think the other piece is that I like to talk to when I'm talking to like bike and pedestrian coordinators, and most of them like feel very strongly about what they're doing, and they're really passionate about it. But the average person isn't. And so what I tell them is when you have, there's a small group of bikers that's in any city, but if you can bring scooters and suddenly there's now tens of thousands of people that are experiencing the road as a vulnerable road user, that creates so much new political capital for making investments in the kinds of things that, the folks in the shared mobility community care about, livable, walkable streets. And so it really is creating that political capital.
And one thing that I would add kind of to this, the idea that we need more runway for these services. So if you look at Amsterdam and Copenhagen in the 70s, they were becoming very car dependent, car focused communities. And today they are bicycling meccas, right? That took decades of work and advocacy and developing their community and closing down roads and turning plazas that were once public space that had become parking lots back into public space. That was a slow process over many years, and it will take the same thing. And so if you have a private sector partner, you need to give them the assurances that they're not going to have to be competing in a hyper-competitive environment to get a permit every year. And then making that permit fee difficult for them to get into the black. So I think the space and the way that micromobility, scooters and electric bikes can really drive more public space for active transportation is a wonderful thing. But we also need to be realistic that that's going to be a change that's going to take several years, and that's not going to happen overnight.
And just to put some perspective on what kind of support we've got from cities is like, one is what we can expect from cities is like infrastructure investment, and the permit fees could be longer term permit applications or commitment, and then utilizing that permit fees into infrastructure, which, like Ben pointed out and also Molly said, there are many things that needs to be done. It's like safety of the new micromobility riders, who are not keen on riding bikes, but then now they are keen on riding scooters, and also being stolen. So operators, like, how much of a factor of safety can you put up? So if you're talking about like 2,000 scooters, going by that multiple, is it going to be like, I don't know, 14,000 scooters in a year? Which is totally not feasible. And when we talk about like all cities having their climate action plans and transportation master plans merging together into the sustainability drive, we see zero emission vehicles being supported through rebates. And there is a big funding amount which goes towards that. Personally, I feel that is still fueling the car culture and like trying to give, if you were not, kind of not to, for the lack of a better example, it's like Coke replaced by Diet Coke or something like that. So it's not actually something that is great, but can we expect something more from cities or governments to support micromobility instead of just cars and electric vehicles in general? Start with you, Elliot, and then Molly and Ben.
Yeah, I mean, definitely one of the things when we were looking, we had done some of the earliest market research in bike share on electric vehicles. One of the funding mechanisms we were looking at was a pretty aggressive rebate program through our public energy utility. There was a $400 per vehicle rebate on fleets of electric bikes. So there are things like that that can be done. Cities are really good at making infrastructure investments. We've talked about bike lanes, but charging stations is another way they can make investments and build whole kind of mobility hubs around that, so you can charge both micromobility and what we're seeing as a pilot in the Twin Cities with our community car sharing partner. Our car is doing an electric car share, so these are charging stations for personal cars but also for shared vehicles. So those are the kind of things I think cities can be looking at to really help build the base that'll make these businesses successful. The interstate highway system built the suburbs, and it built the car-dependent culture we're in. That infrastructure did that. So we need to make that investment along with making sure the public transit system is really strong, so that you've got that interaction between shared mobility and transit. But cities can be doing that, and that has multiple. That can serve the individual vehicle owner, but it can also serve shared mobility providers.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. And just within the U.S. right now, never mind a rebate, the 25% tariff for importing goods from China. Oh my goodness, the bikes and the e-bikes, and I don't know if scooters are included in that, but holy cow, that is it's just such a a difficult fee to swallow right now, and especially in this time when we are having kind of a bicycle boom and people are using those vehicles. So absolutely, I think there's a huge role to provide incentives, rebates, to kind of make these options not more attractive, but to gather a share of the purse.
Yeah, I remember I did some rough math a while back, definitely pre-pandemic, but a scooter is about 1% of the mass of a Tesla. So just moving the vehicle, you're 99% more efficient, right? Even if everything else is exactly the same. So all things being equal, it's 2 orders of magnitude improvement that you can get if you get somebody out of an electric car and into a bike or a scooter. There's a couple members of Congress, Earl Blumenauer and Jimmy Panetta, that just introduced a bill called the E-Bikes Act, which would provide up to a $1,500 credit for bikes. I think that'd be awesome if that passes. And even as a shared provider, again, the more people that we can get to create political capital for infrastructure is great. So I'm all about, I own an e-bike. My wife owns an e-bike. We use them to get around all the time. They're awesome. So anything the government can do, again, you can, like an electric car credit in the U.S., I believe, is $7,500. So, you're getting somewhere, 5 to, I think it's a sliding scale, so it's less for cheaper bikes, but, 5 to 10x the number of vehicles. So 5 to 10x the number of people out of a car if you're getting them an e-bike. There's just huge opportunities to make transportation more efficient, both from a throughput standpoint, but also from a sustainability standpoint.
Awesome. I'm happy that you mentioned the rebates that are coming up from the E-Bike Act. BC in Canada also has a program called Scrap It, and through that we are able to give out rebates or refund like up to 1,500 Canadian dollars towards an e-bike or an e-cargo bike. The only thing is it comes off when people replace their cars, so scrap their cars to get an e-bike, which is a great way to start. You mentioned about moving scooters, Ben. I think that is a great segue into the last question that we have. How critical is rebalancing in terms of when we are talking about financials for operators, and how big a pie does it take away today?
Yeah, we definitely got kind of sort of in a little segue there, but coming back to the economics of scooter share specifically, it's hard to say, which is not a very satisfying answer maybe, but in places like Santa Monica that are very dense, it's not as much. So one of our other great markets is Columbus, Ohio. Columbus, Ohio has it's 800,000 people spread out over a huge area. And there's dense areas like around Ohio State University and downtown, and there's some other areas that are quite dense, but scooters are all over the whole city. So rebalancing in some of the far-flung areas are quite expensive and can be quite problematic. In dense areas, it's not that challenging at all. And in some places, we use e-bikes with trailers where we can just put the scooters on a trailer, swap them out, bring them around. It's easier to get through some of those dense areas. But I think that, rebalancing in general is a bit of a symptom. And the real issue is we haven't quite solved the parking issue yet. The industry in general has matured quite a bit, and I think parking is in a much better place than it was 2 or 3 years ago, but it's still not quite where it needs to be. And that's, partly because there's not the right infrastructure. There's not enough bike racks. There's not enough specific corrals. They're being parked on the sidewalk. It's also a cultural issue. For your whole life, you've been taught, where to park a car and follow the signs and do all that. None of that signage is there for scooters. And also just, some people just, they also park in the handicap spot and they block the crosswalk, and some people just, aren't very courteous when they use whatever vehicle or thing they have. So I think once as cities and operators evolve together, that will resolve itself. And again, is there infrastructure that is involved in there? One of the issues with docking stations writ large is that in order for docking stations to be really effective, you need a lot of them. You almost need one on every block and potentially every side of the street. And then the docking stations become problematic in themselves because now there's 2,000 docking stations around the city, and that's like very expensive and hard to get permits for, and those have political problems as well. So I'm not sure where it's going. A lot of smart people are thinking about it, and it's going somewhere, but we're not there yet.
Awesome. I know, Elliot, you had great, strong feelings about rebalancing being the biggest cost factor for operators.
Yeah, I mean, I think it leads to a lot of issues that we talked about that I think is a really problematic with the model the way it is today. You have a vehicle that is lightweight that can be picked up and moved, and so you get a lot of theft, you get a lot of damage. We operated the first seated scooter system, one of the first in the U.S. We had people who threw them off of parking garages. There's nothing I can do to recoup that cost at that point. And so, I think it's a balance between, yes, dockless from the consumer's standpoint means you don't have to walk as far to a station, but fundamentally, my cost for running dockless was an order of magnitude more expensive than my station-based system. And so I think you're going to need to find a balance on that to get to profitability longer term. I think you're going to have a hybrid where, especially as you have more and more vehicles and they have more and more charging demand, having a warehouse full of chargers is not a super efficient way of doing things either. So yeah, I think there's still a lot of challenges in that space, and I just think the model right now, barring a development that greatly enhances battery life and addresses that theft and loss issue, I don't see how you get around that. You're going to need to have some way to secure this vehicle and get it charged, and that we're back to everything old is new again. We're back to station-based systems or a hybrid of that.
Okay, there could be a hybrid system. Molly, from your experience from bike share.
Well, I'll actually speak to seated scooter share, where in Vancouver we did not actually launch the program, but in preparation for hopefully getting a permit from the city, I did a lot of research and work and got to intimately know where all the charging outlet points were in parking lots and private businesses. But I will say that yes. What would have been ideal, were those kind of charging hubs, some infrastructure that the city already had that we could have accessed. It would have made it much simpler.
So that is great. That I really want to keep this discussion going on, but probably we'll have to have a follow-up session on this topic soon. Before we wrap up, I would like to have closing comments from each of you. Let's go with Molly, Elliot, and then Ben on the focus for micromobility, focus for profitability for micromobility is Molly.
I would say public-private partnerships. I think we know that this is a form of transportation, a mode of transportation that people want to use, and to both Elliot and Ben's points, different people use bikes, e-bikes, scooters. So there is a place for all of them within our city spaces, and I think it's going to take runway, continued conversations and flexibility on both the sides of the operators and the cities. But if it's a problem we can solve, our cities are going to be so much better for it in the long run. Sorry, but no magic answers.
We wish, Elliot.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think the key for long-term profitability, I mean, I think the work that's being done and has been done over the last couple of years to improve the quality of the vehicles, really focus on tuning in the operational efficiency is huge. But in truth, I think there are going to be still relatively few markets where private sector alone, that kind of investment is going to make scooter share and bike share profitable in the near term. And so, I think you're going to need to see the public sector really step up, and that's one in making the longer term commitments to partners, not just season by season, but multi-year commitments that possibly include some funding support, especially in serving areas that aren't going to be profitable, but that have huge community need. But I think the place where we can really excel is stepping up in that infrastructure space. That's building the charging infrastructure. That's building protected bike lanes. That is changing the land development code so that we're building dense interconnected communities that support active transportation and shared mobility, and funding a first-class transit system that serves that as well. So those are all things. There's not an easy answer there, but those are things that if you can point all of those things in the right direction, you're going to see a huge change. And I think that shared mobility and micromobility will finally come true on its promise.
Thanks. Yeah, super interesting. And I would do a big +1 to everything that Molly and Elliot said. From the operator standpoint, I think there's sort of two different ways to think about it. And one, there's the actual operations of like the scooter company, right? And I think the two biggest drivers of profitability are depreciation and charging costs, which we sort of talked about a little bit. And those have charging and rebalancing and then depreciation are the biggest levers in general. But there's all this other stuff that sort of is in the ecosystem, like Elliot mentioned, transit integration, right? Would love to do transit integration better, but that's hard for a couple reasons. One, integrating payment systems is incredibly complicated. From a legal standpoint, from a technical standpoint, from an engineering standpoint, it can take months or years to get the resources to do that. So having some help even just to A, provide resources to us, but B, providing resources to the transit agency to have partnerships. In a lot of cities, you can't even find somebody at the transit agency to talk to coordinate with them. So, how do you set up an MOU so that you can integrate into their trip planner, or so that you can deploy scooters at the parking lot outside of the transit station or something like that? How do you get those things? So there's a lot of things that you don't think about that really go into making that seamless transportation system more broadly. So I would just sum up to say that it's amazing to me how much the industry has, how far we've come in the last 3 years. I think we've got a lot more to go, but I'm also excited that folks like you guys that I'm here on the panel with, and hopefully the folks that are watching as well, are so thoughtful, and we're going to solve the challenges that we have. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. And as a takeaway from my side, I have that the key towards financial modeling in micromobility is about getting it right in the collaboration side. So public-private partnerships, as everybody agreed. If you look at a balance sheet, for example, it's about retained earnings and how we are able to build that up. In the financials for micromobility, it's about what has been already invested from the vehicle side, from the infrastructure side, and from the permit fees, and all that legality is put together. How is that being able to fuel the business? Definitely there is a long-term commitment required. And since there is long-term commitment from the vehicle, the operator side, they should be ready to do more investment in their vehicles, data, and a sustainable way and an equitable way of rebalancing and managing the operations. Whereas from the city side, it's about building the infrastructure, promoting more people to come on board, and helping improve utilization at the same time building these hubs, like talking about transit hubs, if it makes sense, where it doesn't make sense, charging hubs where it could be multimodal, not just cars, but then also micromobility, probably a different ratio, more for micromobility and less for cars, and start thinking about how the whole transportation, like each of you said, it's like an ecosystem, trying to build that and not thinking about just one mode or the other. Thank you so much, guys. It was a lot of fun, and I'm sure that our viewers have a lot of insights from this. We should be able to do this again sometime as a follow-up because micromobility and financials doesn't get old either. Thank you so much, and hopefully talk to you soon.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.